Morning, everybody. Good to be sharing with you again today. I'd like to just start off by reading you a little story. A man wanted to become a monk, and so he went to the monastery and talked to the head monk. And the head monk said to him, "You must take a vow of silence and can only say 2 words every 3 years." The man agreed, and after the first 3 years, the head monk came to him and said, "What are your 2 words?" "Food cold," the man replied. 3 more years went by and the head monk came to him and said, "What are your 2 words?" "Robe dirty," the man exclaimed. 3 more years went by and the head monk came to him and said, "What are your 2 words?" "I quit," says the man. "Well," the head monk replied, "I'm not surprised. You've done nothing but complain ever since you got here." And the title of my sermon today is From Whining to Shining. And basically what the Apostle Paul is saying in the verses we're going to look at is that God's people need to move from whining to shining. So we're continuing with our series in Philippians and we're looking at chapter 2, verses 14 to 18 today. So let's turn there and read. Philippians 2 and verse 14 says this: "Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour for nothing. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me." I love the verses that Alan preached from a couple of weeks ago. He preached from verses 12 to 13, and it says, "Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it's God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose." You know, and as Alan was telling us, that these verses teach us that we have a part to play in our salvation, not earning it, but making it work with God's help. And I love the truth that God lives in us by his Spirit, and his job is to help us live the Christian life. And so he creates desires within us that are in line with God's will. And thus, as we cooperate with him, he changes us from the inside out. Isn't it amazing how over time, as we immerse ourselves in the Word of God, we find that God's desires actually become our desires. And this chapter is all about emulating Jesus in our lives. It's about how we conduct our lives as Christians. We saw in chapter 1 and verse 27 that Paul tells us, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And again he says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. And we saw a few weeks back that God's heavenly calling on our lives is to be holy. And I was telling you the best description of being holy I've ever heard is living beautifully for Jesus. Not that we never do anything wrong. We live in a fallen world and we're not yet perfect people. So it's inevitable that from time to time we might slip up and sin. But the Bible teaches us in 1 John 2 and verse 1 that if we do happen to sin, there is forgiveness. The cup's never empty and the plate's always full. We're always welcome at the table of grace. I love it. So holiness is about seeking to live beautifully for Jesus. And in our verses today, Paul becomes very practical in teaching us how to live beautifully for Jesus. And he deals with something which is quite surprising really in verse 14, grumbling, complaining, and arguing. And I'm sure looking at these words, we wouldn't really put them alongside some other sins that go on the heart that we would consider pretty serious, that need dealing with. But nevertheless, Paul highlights them and he simply says, do everything without complaining or arguing. Other translations have the words grumbling and moaning. And when I was thinking about preaching this during the week, I thought, I really don't need to preach this to our people. I wouldn't call them a grumbling and complaining and arguing sort of people. But then I was reminded I don't know what goes on behind closed doors. I remember when I was a teenager, things weren't always happy-clappy at home, and we were all Christians. Sometimes we'd go to church and we'd had a massive row and nobody would know about it. Funny, isn't it, how Sunday morning is often a magnet for these things. And we're all in the same boat. It's so comforting, isn't it? As a teenager, I was pretty argumentative, and I often left the house slamming the door in a mood because nobody understood me. I know you can't believe it. But, there's lots of similar stories, between us all. I'm not alone here in this, am I? I don't know what goes on in your family. I don't know what goes on in your heart. All I know is what goes on in my heart. And I know that sometimes I am prone to grumble and complain. And the truth of the matter is that we are all actually prone to it to one degree or another. I honestly can't think of one of you who I would think of as a grumbler, a moaner, or a complainer. I'm sure we've all come across people who are constantly grumbling and complaining, about the weather, about the husband, about the wife, about the kids, about the in-laws, about the neighbours' dogs, about the job, about what other people have said to them and done to them, about the government. We hear a lot of that, don't we? About their ailments, about their hair, about their weight. And so the list goes on. Nothing is ever right. A man sat on a park bench, so depressed looking that a policeman tried to console him. Something the matter? Yeah, replied. A few months ago, my grandfather left me £500,000 and some oil wells. And the policeman responded, well, that doesn't sound like something to be upset over. Yeah, but you haven't heard the whole story. Last month, my uncle left me £1 million. And the policeman shook his head. I don't get it. Why are you so unhappy? He replied, well, so far this month, nobody's left me anything. Some people are never happy. But in all seriousness, it gets you down to be in the company of someone who is always moaning, doesn't it? And although I don't think any of us are grumblers per se, we do need to keep a check on this area of our lives and be open to the Holy Spirit or to other people prompting us as we slip into this mode of thinking and speaking. I wouldn't describe myself as a grumbler or a complainer, although I do object to cold food that I'm paying for, and I think I'm quite justified in complaining about that. But there are times when I do find myself grumbling and complaining about all sorts of things at times, I've got to clean the house, or I've got to go shopping, or I've got to deal with policies, or I've got to cut the grass. I remember years ago I was moaning to myself about having to cut the grass at my house because I didn't want to do it. And as I was grumbling about it to myself, I was brought up sharp, and I suddenly thought, there are so many people in this world who would love to have even a little garden to enjoy and look after. And here I am moaning because I've got to. And I was reminded that instead of complaining, I should be grateful and give thanks that I'm blessed with a garden, a home to clean, a food to cook, hot water, heating, a bed, nice clothes, a car, holidays, friends, my family, a church family, health, a job, and that I live in a free country. So many people in this world do not have these privileges. I remember my first visit to a third world country. I went to India, and I tell you, going there cured me of complaining about living in the UK. As I was walking past rubbish tips on the streets where people lived, I specifically remember thinking to myself, I will never complain again about paying poll tax. And I never have. And then I went to Ghana and I saw the same things again. And then we went to Kenya and we met Christians who welcomed them into their mud hut homes. And we were staggered that people lived in such places, and we came home appreciating every single blessing that we have in this country. We are so blessed. We are well looked after, and we have so much to be thankful for in every area of our lives. It's true, we go through difficult times in life, but in addition to many material blessings, we are rich with spiritual blessings, grace upon grace to help us and sustain us in life. Lamentations 3 in verses 22 to 23 says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. New every morning. Great is your faithfulness." What a fantastic verse, eh? Every morning when we wake up, his mercies are new. His presence is still with us. His grace is still abounding. The well of salvation has not run dry. It's full, and we can draw on it every single morning afresh. We're welcome at the table of grace every single day. And it's incumbent upon us as Christians to start each day with a grateful heart. You know, we live in a society where grumbling and complaining is the order of the day, and at the slightest inconvenience, people complain. Someone has said some people are always grumbling. If they'd been born in the Garden of Eden, they would have found much to complain about. In some parts of Mexico, I read this, hot springs and cold springs are found side by side. And because of the convenience of this natural phenomenon, the women often bring their laundry and boil their clothes in the hot springs and then rinse them in the cold ones. A tourist who was watching this procedure commented to his Mexican guide, "I imagine that these women think old Mother Nature is pretty generous to supply such ample, clean, hot and cold water here side by side for their free use." And the guide answered, "Not really. There's a lot of grumbling because they have to bring their own soap." Griping and complaining and grumbling come quite naturally. We don't have to remind ourselves to do it, but we do have to challenge our souls to thank God. Psalm 103 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord and forget not all his benefits." David, who wrote this psalm, is talking to himself. He's talking to his own soul and directing his soul what to do, to bless the Lord and to remember what good things God has done and to thank him. We sing that fantastic song, we will remember the things that God has done. Do everything without complaining and arguing. Paul's not mincing his words, is it? And in response, this is something we constantly need to be working on in our lives with the Spirit's help. And my prayer for us all is that our spirit and attitude of gratitude will continue to increase and to grow. So we in life, we grumble and complain about things, but there's another really, really important area in our lives that we need to consider about whether we grumble and complain about. And we'll pick this up now in verse 15. In verse 15, Paul gives us the reason why we shouldn't be grumbling and complaining people. In verse 15, it says, "Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe." And basically, what he's saying is that it's very unbecoming for a Christian to be grumbling and complaining and arguing. That is not beautiful living. In fact, it's the opposite. It's ugly. It's unattractive. It will put people off and give them grounds to criticize us and call into question our faith and even call us hypocrites, you know, and say things like, "Well, I thought you were supposed to be a Christian." It's about our testimony to the world. And as we know, in this world in which we live, we need to be standing out as different. We need to move from whining to shining. I want to be a shining Christian, don't you? Paul says that we live in a crooked and depraved generation. And when we live beautifully with Jesus, we will shine in the darkness like stars. And Paul uses 3 words in these verses to describe what we should be like: blameless, pure, and without fault. People observe how we live as Christians, and so our attitudes and our actions and our morality are all important. I love the story of Daniel in the Old Testament, who served in a pagan government. You know, his enemies were jealous of him and looked for something in him that they could use to bring him down, but they were unable to do so. And it says in Daniel that they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Daniel was a man of integrity, and he lived in such a way that brought glory to God. He shone like a star. And Paul's message to us today is that we too should be people of integrity and not allow our light to be clouded or snuffed out by complaining and arguing. Let's be different to the generation in which we live, and let's shine out for God. And it's very interesting that there are two phrases that Paul uses in this verse 15 that take us back to the Old Testament. And this brings me on to my second thought about grumbling and complaining. And the two phrases are children of God and a crooked and depraved generation. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were known as children of God. God had chosen the nation of Israel to be a light to the world, to reveal to the world what being a child of God was like, and to reveal what God the Father is like. They were to shine for him. And as the children of God, the Israelites experienced incredible things. When they were living as slaves in Egypt, life was so bad that they cried out to God to deliver them, and he heard their cry. And he sent Moses to deliver them, and so began a journey of them witnessing the most incredible acts of God's power, with unthinkable plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of their enemies. They could never have dreamed it. It was totally mind-blowing. At last they were free, no longer slaves, no longer being mistreated, no longer oppressed. They were free, and they were on a road to a new life. But something happened 3 days later as God led them into the wilderness. And this is what began to happen. They began to grumble, complain, and argue. And this is why they came to a place where there was no water. Now let me ask you a question. If you had experienced God parting the Red Sea 3 days earlier, what do you think you might be saying if you were faced with no water? We'd like to think we'd be singing that song we learnt in Sunday school. God can do it again and again and again. He's the same God today as he always has been. Yesterday, now today, and forever the same. There's no reason to doubt God can do it again. Wouldn't you think that they just think, well, so what? God who's just parted the sea for us can provide water. Easy peasy. What is that to him? But unbelievably, we read that the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what are we going to drink? Why did you bring us out here to die of thirst? And then they grumbled because there was no food. And then they grumbled because there was no meat. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumber and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. It's unbelievable that they forgot the bad days and their cries of desperation, and they forgot the mighty power of God that delivered them. What a terrible testimony, eh? And here's the point. In their grumbling against Moses and disputing with him, they were actually grumbling and disputing against the Lord who had led them that way. Psalm 78, is a brilliant recounting of their time in the desert, and the psalmist puts it like this. When they moaned about the water, God sent gushes of it. But even though God did this, they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the desert against the Most High. And they demanded food, saying, can God spread a table in the desert? Yes, he's provided us with plenty of water, but can he also give us food? Can you believe they said it after all they'd experienced of God in the recent years and days? And Psalm 78 tells us that unsurprisingly, when God heard what they said, he was very angry because they did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. And yet, amazingly, he did provide for them. The psalm says that he opened the doors of heaven and he rained down manna for the people to eat. It says, the grain of heaven, the bread of angels. And he sent them all the food they could eat. He rained down meat on them like dust. And they had more than enough, for he had given them what they craved. But he was angry with them and he put to death the sturdiest of the young men. And verse 32 says this, in spite of this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. And then unbelievably, when they needed water again, guess what happened? They grumbled and complained. These so-called children of God were disloyal to God and faithless. Instead of trust and worship, there came grumbling, murmuring, complaining, arguing against Moses. They went from shining to whining, and their light was snuffed out. And sometime later, Moses wrote a song in which he said this about the Israelites of that generation. They have acted corruptly towards God. Towards their shame, to their shame, they are no longer his children, but a warped and crooked generation. How sad. Those who were God's children became rebellious and turned into people they were not destined to be because they failed to trust. And they turned away from God when things were not to their liking. And the Bible tells us that these things are written as examples and warnings for us. So let's heed the warning. You know, there's two sorts of grumbling. We can grumble about things and stuff like that, but we can also grumble about, we can grumble in our hearts towards God. God did amazing things for these people, but then he led them into the wilderness. He led them into an uncomfortable place, but it didn't need to be the place they made it. To their detriment, rather than remembering, they forgot the hardships of the place they'd come from. They forgot the things God had done for them, and they didn't believe him again for water and food. Their trust was no longer in him. And sometimes in our lives, God may lead us into a desert place. But having thought about the Israelites in the desert, let's consider our reaction when we are in such a place. It's actually easy for us to criticize the Israelites and say, the way they behaved is unbelievable. But actually, people are the same the world over. We're no different to them. Our natural tendency as humans is to grumble and complain and doubt. But Paul is telling us in chapter 2 of Philippians that we shouldn't do it. Rather, let us hold on to God. Let us declare his goodness and the power of days gone by. Let's lift up our Ebenezer and say, thus far, God has brought us, and therefore we know that he will see us through. Let's push into God. Let's draw near to him. Let's believe him again. Let's shine like stars in the darkness, showing those around us what it means and what it's like to be a child of God. That's what's holding out the word of life, as Paul says in verse 16. But we could also say of that phrase that we will shine like stars as we hold on to the word of life, as we hold on to it. The onus is on us to keep close to Jesus, isn't it? Can God spread a table in the desert? Yes, he can. And everyone is welcome at that table. We need to come and eat. We need to come and receive. And then Paul ends these few thoughts by saying, if you live like this, in verse 16, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run or labour for nothing. He says, if you live like this, you will make my joy complete. Remember, joy is the theme of this book. He says, I've worked hard to teach you how to live. I've taught you, I've set you example. This has been the race in my race in life, to share the gospel with you and to help you grow in your faith. This is what I've laboured for, and this is why I'm in prison now and facing possible death. But my joy is that on the day I stand before God, I will be able to stand proud knowing that it has not been in vain. As you offer your lives to God as a living sacrifice, surrendering your lives to his will and service, saying yes to him, this is an offering pleasing and acceptable to him. Let's read verse 17. Paul ends this section by saying, but even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. And so too you should be glad and rejoice with me. I don't know if you know this, but in Numbers 28, we're told that the people had to bring daily offerings to the Lord. They had to bring a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening and sacrifice it before the Lord. And that's a good rhythm for us in life, isn't it? Offering praise and worship and thanks in the morning and in the evening, and also offering our lives every day. But alongside the offering, the lamb, a drink offering of wine was an important part of the sacrifice. And it was poured out as the final part of the sacrifice. It made it complete. And it's interesting that the final thing that happened to Jesus on the cross after he died was that a soldier pierced his side and water and blood flowed out of him. And it made the sacrifice complete. And Paul was facing death for the sake of the gospel. And he felt that this would be like the final act of service poured out for the sake of the people. The final offering of wine on the sacrifice and service coming from the faith of the Philippians. And with this thought, he rejoiced. He wasn't grumbling and complaining. He was a shining star in the dark night of his soul. And he says to them, you too should be glad and rejoice with me. So we're coming to an end now, and just want to come back to this thought of maybe you're in the wilderness at the moment. Can I encourage you to press into God in it and not turn away? Job says he knows the way that I take, and when he has tested me, he shall bring me forth like gold. It's true we don't always understand his ways, but let's not turn away from him. He's still God. He is still able to set a table in the desert. He is still faithful. He is still in control. And in these days of great uncertainty and hardship in our country, let's not be found grumbling and complaining, but rather let's shine like stars, declaring our trust and our confidence is in him who can provide a table in the desert. He's still God. When the government has no answers, he's still God. Let's keep our minds on him. Let's keep trusting him. Let's keep looking to him. Let's keep leaning on him. Let's keep believing him. Let's keep feeding on Jesus, the living bread. His arm is not too short. The cattle on 1,000 hills belongs to him. The wealth in every mine. And the children's song that we sing is, our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. So let's be a shining people, not a whining people, but a shining people. Amen. God bless you this week as you go out there to shine for him, and may he give you great joy. And every morning, can I encourage you to wake up with an attitude of gratitude. God bless you all. Bye.